Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll look into a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with the culmination of 7 decades of collective punishment of the Cuban people from a blockade of sanctions, with the Trump administration now turning the screws on the island, cutting off oil, which is causing blackouts as the long-suffering Cubans run out of food, water, and electricity, while children beg in the streets filled with garbage that is piling up. Joining us to discuss rumors that Raul Castro's son is negotiating with the CIA in Mexico City for a regime transition along the lines of Venezuela is Michael Bustamente, Associate Professor of History and the Emilio Bacardi Moreau Chair in Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami. He serves as the Director of Academic Programs at the Cuban Heritage Collection, the largest archival repository dedicated to Cuban materials outside of the island and the largest collection of materials on the Cuban diaspora in the world, and is the author of Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile, and the co-editor of The Revolution from Within, Cuba 1959 to 1980. And we'll discuss his article at the Journal of Democracy, With Maduro Gone, Is Cuba Ready to Fall? Then we'll go to the Munich Security Conference, where Secretary of State Marco Rubio made nice without one mention of Ukraine, and speak with Charles Kupchan, who was Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. He's now a Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and spent the last 3 years of the Obama administration as Special Assistant to President Obama for National Security. He's the author of The End of the American Era, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Geopolitics of the 21st Century, Power in Transition, The Peaceful Change for International Order and How Enemies Become Friends, The Source of Stable Peace, and his latest, Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. Then finally, we'll examine Trump's payoff to the fossil fuel industry, in which he has delivered a death sentence to our children and grandchildren and the planet by ending efforts to deal with global warming as storms intensify and wildfires rage, and our competitors move to renewable energy. Joining us is Michael Mann, Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania and Director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. He contributed to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize and was elected to the United States National Academy of Sciences in 2020, and is the author of numerous books including Dire Predictions, Understanding Climate Change, The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet, and his latest book is Science Under Siege, How to Fight the 5 Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our Planet. And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is Michael Bustamente, who is an Associate Professor of History and the Emilio Bacardi Moreau Chair in Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami. He serves as Director of Academic Programs at the Cuban Heritage Collection, the largest archival repository dedicated to Cuban materials outside of the island, and the largest collection of materials on the Cuban diaspora in the world. and he's the author of Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile, and co-editor of The Revolution from Within, Cuba 1959 to 1980, and he has an article, The Journal of Democracy, With Maduro Gone, Is Cuba Ready to Fall? Welcome to Background Briefing, Michael Bustamente.
Thanks for having me and the generous introduction.
Well, thanks for joining us. And what do you make of this article in The Guardian by a Scotsman who lives in Cuba married to a Cuban academic, and he's got children and obviously got deep roots in the country? And the title of the article is No Water or Electricity and Children Begging in the Streets Filled with Rubbish, but this is why I won't leave Cuba. Whether you blame the US or the communist regime, there is no doubt that this is an island spiraling into tragedy. Do you see that on the horizon, Michael?
I mean, I think the tragedy is already with us. I think it's been with Cubans for some time. Cubans have lived through cycles of tragedy, depending on sort of which historical moment, cycles of intense hope followed by intense tragedy, I would argue. And I think Cuba is definitely in the midst of one of the more intense versions of that cycle. You know, go back 10 years ago, Cuba was a place, not universally, of course, but a place filled with a considerable amount of hope on the backs of the beginnings of efforts at domestic reform, or that was the hope. And then the Obama administration's efforts at normalizing ties with the island kind of piggybacked on that. And 10 years later, you know, Cuba's in the midst of its worst economic crisis in 30 years. And it's lost more than 10% of its population to migration. It's the largest exodus in Cuban history. So, you know, reading the article really resonated with me. It's a long read, I think, of someone who's been in the country and kind of lived through this cycle and seen it up close.
So it's always been, though, a story of collective punishment in terms of U.S. foreign policy, hasn't it? I mean, that's what the 70 years of an embargo is about. So is collective punishment U.S. foreign policy? Are we just going to simply ramp it up and wait for the index of misery to be such that somehow that government will fall?
Yeah, I have long been, to put it mildly, suspicious of a strategy of unilateral sanctions that, to my mind, has done more over time to hurt Cuban citizens than it ever has done anything to dislodge the Cuban government. I think it's also worth noting, however, that the argument that the Cuban government will make and does make that attributes the vast majority of the problems that the society is enduring to US sanctions is one that in recent years has lost a lot of currency with average Cuban people as they have watched their government bungle at least a decade, if not more, of opportunities to pursue at a minimum economic reform, to say nothing of political reform. Economic liberalization, by the way, that not just the United States is telling them they need to do, it's Vietnam, it's China, it's Russia, it's all their ideological partners, right? That said, I think one of the kind of odd risks in a sort of cold geopolitical way right now of this newly intense strategy of collective punishment via this oil blockade is that the United States might actually end up distracting attention from the very real failings of the Cuban government at home. What they're doing now seems to me a very risky gambit to try to force a situation that is so dire from a humanitarian point of view that the Cuban government feels compelled to come to the negotiating table and cede in a way that they have never been willing to do before. Whether that happens is a big question, and it's a kind of a game of chicken between both governments. You know, there was a Cuban diplomat last week who I think, you know, said we would rather sink into the sea than cede to the Americans. Most Cubans I know are so frustrated and desperate that they might want to see their government cede a little bit, that they might even see that as an act of patriotism at this moment. But we have two governments that are incredibly stubborn, entrenched, and the Cuban people are in the middle. And I'm deeply concerned about what the consequences are going to be.
Well, the Spanish press is reporting that Raul Castro's son, Alejandro Castro Espin, is engaged in exploratory conversations in Mexico with CIA officials, and that presumably what the talks are about, if they are indeed happening, which I suspect they are, would be along the model of what just happened in Venezuela, right? The old guard goes into exile, and the new generation makes deals with the U.S., et cetera, et cetera. Is that so? What do we know about those talks going on in Mexico?
We know virtually nothing. There's been, one report in the Spanish newspaper, as you mentioned. I think these rumors of talks got picked up by Politico, but based on a social media post that was unsourced and and more rumor than anything else. Look, it's not impossible that Alejandro Castro Espín could be sort of tapped as a kind of an interlocutor for the Cuban government with the United States in a moment like this. He is the person that led the back channel negotiations with the Obama administration that led to normalization at the tail end of 2014. But the end game of those negotiations is not clear to me, particularly when you think about the kind of personnel of this administration. Is Alejandro Castro Espín jockeying for a position as one of those people of a new generation that can step in and be the Delcy Rodriguez figure? Do we really think a Rubio can sell to this administration, let alone to his constituents in South Florida, the idea of doing business with a government led by another Castro? That stretches credulity for me. There aren't really obvious figures in the Cuban government, it seems to me, that can play the role of a Delcy Rodriguez. There aren't sort of these independent or semi-autonomous power centers in the government in the way that there were in Venezuela. So while I certainly would welcome the idea that there are talks ongoing rather than not at all, it really is unclear to me sort of what the end game would be and how far it would go. The only other thing I would say on this is that, the Secretary of State just made an interesting set of comments in Munich, in which he emphasized his long view that the Cuban political system needs to change, but also gave particular attention to the need for the Cuban economy to liberalize and seemed to open space there for the idea of economic openings, perhaps on their own, at least to start, being one way to kind of get the ball going in terms of ratcheting down tensions. So I don't know. I think that's interesting, and we're going to obviously have to watch to see what happens and whether these rumors of talks are real or not.
So, what do we know about the Castro family's fortune in the sense that there's this company called Gaesa, which is supposed to have tons of money, and throughout the time of Fidel Castro, it was always often said that there was no distinction between the Cuban treasury and Fidel Castro's personal bank account. So, if Raul Castro's son is having secret negotiations with the CIA for transition, what would happen to all that money? Because it's pretty horrible, isn't it, if the elite have all that money while the people are suffering?
Yeah, obviously, the Cuban government isn't the most transparent about its financial dealings. The generous interpretation of that is their lack of transparency has to do with sanctions avoidance. And I mean generous from the point of view of what would be logical from their point of view, right? Certainly, the dealings of Gaesa, the military conglomerate that you mentioned, have been the subject of a lot of attention. There was a sort of a blockbuster report in the Miami Herald within the last year that, based on allegedly leaked financial statements from Gaesa itself, alleged that Gaesa had its balance sheet showed $18 billion in assets. This has often been kind of confused, I think, in some of the reporting and social media commentary thereafter as $18 billion in cash. That's not what the article said. It said that was assets, so that could include, hotel properties, things like that. But nonetheless, the allegations were pretty serious that they're sitting on a significant amount of cash. And the question is, why aren't they investing more of it, right? Or deploying more of it in a humanitarian crisis like this? As for the Castro family's personal fortunes, I have no particular insights there. But again, I think all of this just highlights the challenges of negotiation from a political optics point of view. If you're going to try to negotiate some sort of a deal that's something short of regime collapse because you conclude that there's nothing to replace it, and I happen to generally agree with that conclusion, you're going to need to negotiate with some sector of the government that can at least speak, if not speak for the military, make sure the military would go along because they control a big part of the Cuban economy. But that is the most unpalatable sort of set of actors in the Cuban state for the United States to deal with, because of all the attention that people like the Secretary of State have paid to the financial dealings of a conglomerate like Gaesa. So, how a Secretary of State again comes to South Florida, comes back to the Cuban American community and sells a deal with a Castro or someone that comes out of the Gaesa world, that's a real uphill battle. But on the other hand, what choice would his followers in Miami have but to go along with it? In a sense, what other option would there be? So it's a striking thing to think about that possibility. I'm not sure I quite believe it will get there yet, but we'll see.
Well, I think the role of Mexico, of course, is key in the sense that the U.S. is pressuring Mexico. Obviously, Venezuela stopped sending oil, and the U.S. has an embargo, a huge fleet intercepting any tankers going in and out of Venezuela. But the U.S. government has managed to lean on Mexico to stop oil, sending oil to Cuba. I think the Russians send a little bit of oil. Interesting enough, your article points out, Michael, that the Chinese have been encouraging solar in Cuba at a time when, of course, the U.S. government is turning against renewables. But the role of Mexico, of course, has always been interesting in the sense that the Castro brothers, when they went into exile, they met Che Guevara in Mexico City and plotted the revolution in 1955. And Morena, the party of AMLO, López Obrador, who was very, very fond and close to Cuba, his protege is now the president, Sheinbaum, right? But the U.S. has put her in a bit of a vice, haven't they?
Yeah, completely. And from Claudia Sheinbaum's point of view, it would be understandable for her to conclude that she has bigger fish to fry with the United States when, not too long ago, what, a week ago, if not a little more, the Trump administration was, threatening, interventions of various kinds in Mexican affairs, given the drug issue and obviously the trade issues and tariffs and everything like that. But you're right. For Scheinbaum, for Morena, the Cuba link is not just a sort of a cold geopolitical calculation. It has to do with sort of maintaining their political alliance together and sort of the long symbolism that Cuba has had for a part of the Latin American left that, to my mind, has not had a critical enough eye on actually the complexity of things going on in Cuba and the degree of responsibility that the Cuban government has for some of the society's difficulties, or many of them. But you see Scheinbaum trying to sort of thread this needle. So she's, cut off oil, insisted that she's trying to sort of talk to the Trump administration through diplomatic channels to figure out a way to get it, still be able to ship oil, but also sending other forms of humanitarian aid, foodstuffs, medicines, et cetera, that the Americans are allowing to go through and not protesting. At the same time, also the Trump administration sends its own humanitarian aid to Eastern Cuba through the vehicle of the Catholic Church. But yes, they're in a vice grip. And make no mistake, cutting off of Venezuelan oil, Mexican oil, it eliminates about 50% of the oil imports that Cuba was depending on. So even if the Chinese are helping to roll out solar, which they have, I mean, there's not enough capacity there to yet really make a huge difference. And so this gives the United States extraordinary leverage, and they're trying to use it to exact concessions of some kind. They haven't been quite explicit about what those would be or what the off ramp would be. But again, to go back to a point I made a few minutes ago, it's the Cuban people that are in the middle, and it's unclear to me how long the Cuban government's going to just sort of try to stick it out, whether they try to outlast this administration through, say, the midterms, with the hope that the attention will move on to other problems and other fronts.
But so much of the island's electricity is generated from oil. And when you cut off the electricity, which is apparently there's rolling blackouts across the island, that means that the people who have a hard time getting food in any case, except for the elite and those that work in the dollar economy, the average Cubans, when the electricity goes out, that means that their food in their fridge, what there is of it, is spoiled, right? So it's very tragic what's happening there.
It is absolutely tragic. And just to be crystal clear, I find it morally repulsive at the end of the day that the Cuban people here are sort of cannon fodder for this conflict. It's a conflict between both governments, and the United States has a degree of responsibility here. The situation in Cuba before this oil blockade was already very grave. Blackouts in Havana already of 15 hours a day, right? So the degree of the crisis is not entirely new. That crisis has certainly been aggravated by other U.S. sanctions that have been piled on since the first Trump administration. It's also been aggravated, I would argue, and many Cubans would argue, by Cuban government's own missteps. But make no mistake, as I said a few minutes ago, I think the degree of this kind of oil squeeze and the very dramatic and devastating humanitarian effects that it's going to have, from a United States point of view, risk, again, just casting the attention entirely on what the United States is doing and actually maybe even feeding that old sort of nationalist narrative in Cuba. Not that I think many Cuban people, are ready to rally to sort of the grand defenses of some anti-imperialist cause. I think they are desperate for any kind of relief. But the United States here, in the eyes of global opinion, I think, you break it, you buy it in a sense, right? And they are betting that that the Cuban government will cede in some way before the humanitarian crisis gets past a certain point. And that is a very, very dangerous and at the very least, morally ambiguous game to be playing.
But just in closing, you referred to the Cuban people as the tired majority in your article, Michael, at Journal of Democracy. With Maduro gone, is Cuba ready to fall? You refer to them as a tired majority, and that the government has very little domestic legitimacy in the wake of generational change, bungled economic reforms, and migration, at least of 13% of the population, and the repression of mass protests on 11th of July 2021. So can they repress the government? And that is their reflex, just as the same in Venezuela, the same in Iran. That's what dictatorships do.
Yeah, they can. I mean, they have a monopoly on force. It's been increasingly popular in recent years for critics of the Cuban government to sort of talk about Cuba as a failed state. I think they're trying to make a political point more than a political science point, right? The state apparatus has not completely come apart by any means. Certainly and the operations of state security are one proof of that. The difference in this moment, it seems to me, is that and this is also one other sort of possible end game that the Trump administration may or may not be contemplating, right? If the Cubans don't come to the table, the humanitarian crisis gets so great. Do you get a repeat of those mass protests from July 2021? And will the Cuban government be a little more reticent to come out and sort of bash knees, so to speak, in that kind of a moment for fear of providing the very kind of pretext for an even more aggressive intervention from the United States that they have always sought to avoid? I don't think this Trump administration wants boots on the ground in any prolonged way, certainly not in Venezuela and not in Cuba if they can avoid it. But if you get this is the other point I make in the piece, if you get a real dramatic kind of a collapse of the society or conflict between citizens and the government, it is going to be really tempting for the Trump administration to want to go into Cuba and sort of plant the flag and say, we did it. We did this thing that no other U.S. president had been able to do. We defeated the Cuban Revolution. So I think that's again part of this very dangerous game of chicken that both governments are playing with Cuban people in the middle.
Well, Michael Bustamente, I thank you so much for joining us here today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for your time.
And again, I've been speaking with Michael Bustamente, who is an Associate Professor of History and the Emilio Bacardi Moro Chair in Cuban and Cuban American Studies at the University of Miami. He serves as Director of Academic Programs at the Cuban Heritage Collection, the largest archival repository dedicated to Cuban materials outside of the island and the largest collection of materials on the Cuban diaspora in the world, and is the author of Cuban Memory Wars, Retrospective Politics in Revolution and Exile, and co-editor of Revolution from Within, Cuba, 1959 to 1980, and he has an article in the Journal of Democracy, With Maduro Gone, Is Cuba Ready to Fall? We're going to take a brief station break and back and go to the Munich Security Conference, where Secretary of State Marco Rubio made nice without one mention of Ukraine.
Llego a Puerto, voy para Mayarí. De Alto Cero voy para Marcané.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now from Munich, Germany, is Charles Kupchan, who was Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. He's now a Professor of International Affairs in Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and spent the last 3 years of the Obama administration as Special Assistant to President Obama for National Security. He's the author of Power in Transition, The Peaceful Change of International Order, and How Enemies Become Friends, The Sources of Stable Peace. And his latest book is Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. Welcome to Background Briefing, Charles Kupchan.
Good to be back with you.
Well, thanks for joining us, Charles. And it seems that Secretary of State Rubio's speech was, in a way, designed to be the opposite of J.D. Vance's speech at the last Munich Security Conference. I guess he made nice. How would you describe it?
I think that's about right. I mean, last year, Vance basically threw a bomb into the conference, and for the rest of the weekend, everybody was walking around ashen. This weekend feels very different. Rubio came and he basically gave a speech that was much more in line with traditional American foreign policy, talked about common interests and common values. And in general, the US team here, both Trump administration officials, but also a very large contingent from both the House and the Senate, is basically saying, we still love you. We still want to be your partner. And so a lot of people are breathing a sigh of relief. I'd say there's a certain amount of skepticism as to whether Rubio should be believed. Does he now really represent the Trump administration? But the overall atmosphere here couldn't be more different than it was a year ago.
So is that to say, though, Charles, that the reason that there's so many U.S. senators and congresspeople is because of Trump? In other words, they're there to reassure our European allies and NATO in general that the United States still has a divided government, and as hostile as Trump may be, there is still members of the House and Senate that want to keep the relationship going.
Well, I think that this could be the largest delegation that's ever come to Munich. That was the plan. I think some people may not have come because of the shutdown, the lack of funding. But I think the message is that these senators and congressmen is sending is, we believe that the Atlantic Partnership is essential for the future of both of our societies. We are here to send that message. And if you look at Congress and you look at American public opinion, there still remains very strong support for NATO. There remains strong support for transatlantic partnership. And so in that sense, I think Trump and Vance are outliers. They're sort of out of step with where most of Congress is and where most of the public is. But, listen, this is an administration that doesn't speak with a single voice. Trump changes his mind every hour. And in many respects, Rubio represents the more internationalist, traditional wing of the Republican Party. Vance represents the America First wing of the Republican Party. And so to treat Rubio's speech with at least a grain of skepticism is warranted, simply because he is, I would say, the member of the Trump administration that most fits in with Europeans and with traditional American foreign policy. So generally, people are saying, okay, this is great news. We're sort of back in a better place now, but let's see where this conversation goes.
And were the so-called MAGA intellectuals on foreign policy in attendance, Elbridge Colby and Andy Baker?
Colby was here. He spoke yesterday. I think they all have been told to be on best behavior, and they have supported Trump. They've stood by Trump. There's been no criticism, but they're taking a very different line here, in the sense that the hostility, the condescension, the lecturing, the hectoring of Europe that we saw from Vance last year, that's gone. It's sort of as if Trump had told everybody, you should be on best behavior. And maybe this is a kind of response to Greenland, which I think, Trump's threat to levy tariffs and potentially use force to take Greenland was a near-death experience for the Atlantic Alliance. And so perhaps we're seeing a certain course correction in the wake of that fiasco. But, again, how long is this going to last? When will Vance or someone else say something or do something on Ukraine or on Greenland or on the future of European integration that will set us back. But I would say right now, everybody's pocketing the generally good vibes here in Munich and hoping that this does represent some kind of lasting correction from where we've been over the past year.
Well, there were a couple of things, though, that Rubio said that I find pretty extraordinary, one of which was that the Western leaders had appeased a climate cult and invested in massive welfare state at the cost of defense. And by the way, there was, I think, no mention or scant mention of Ukraine in Rubio's speech. So given what Trump has just done, which is cut the legs out from under any kind of efforts to deal with climate change, that wasn't a particularly hopeful message coming from Rubio. They appease a climate cult.
You know, there were various, I guess you could call it pieces of red meat that were thrown to the MAGA base, right? One of them is the so-called cult or the green scam, the New Deal scam, whatever Trump calls it. And Rubio has to kind of say those kinds of things. There was also a kind of appeal to the nativist orientation of the administration. There wasn't quite this, you guys are destroying yourselves by letting in too many immigrants. But I think Rubio continued this narrative of the real tradition of Atlanticism is white and Christian. And so there were elements in his speech that continued to push that narrative, even though more broadly, this was an effort to kind of reassure the Europeans that, no, this is not a divorce. But you're right, Ian, to say that on critical issues like climate change, like Ukraine, like the future of European integration, there are still very, very significant policy differences, and they're going to continue to make the waters across the Atlantic pretty rough for at least the next 3 years.
Well, didn't Senator Lindsey Graham tell the Europeans to get over Greenland? I can't imagine that necessarily worked.
Yeah, that doesn't go over well. But I do think that one of the things that you're seeing is that Europeans are taking steps to build a more capable military. They're increasing defense spending. They're starting to build out their defense industrial base. And so in that respect, the criticism that comes from Washington, not just from Trump, but from Democrats as well, that the Europeans should stop free riding on the United States, they're hearing that. And they're also motivated by the fact that for the first time since the end of the Cold War, they're scared, right? They are living not far from a Ukraine that continues to get pummeled by Russia. So on that front, you feel that there's real movement. And I think that in the end of the day, that's going to help the Atlantic relationship because Washington is going to pay more attention to Europe and treat Europe with more respect if Europe can bring more geopolitical heft to the table.
But I mentioned Elbridge Colby and Andy Baker, and if you can add also Jared Kushner and Witkoff as well, they seem to be naive about Putin. I mean, Putin's latest offer to lure Trump into accepting a deal on Russia's terms is a $12 trillion economic deal. I mean, that's several times the GDP of Russia, and not to mention that Russia's already in hock to China. It's a completely unrealistic lure, but it looks like they may have fallen for it.
Yeah, I would say that Ukraine is probably the issue where Europe and the Trump administration remain furthest apart. I think Europeans feel that Trump continues to throw Ukraine under the bus, that he has put on the table a deal whereby he's forcing Zelensky to withdraw from Donbass in return for some kind of security guarantee that it will be flimsy. Europeans don't understand why Trump is not sending more weapons to Ukraine and why he's not pressuring Russia rather than offering lucrative business deals. And you know, I think we remain in a bad place on Ukraine because the negotiations don't seem to be advancing. The bombing of Ukraine as we speak in the middle of winter, very cold. You know, a lot of people don't have light. A lot of people don't have heat. It's very difficult to make it through the day in Ukraine, and I think it is questionable how long Zelensky can last. And so I think in some respects, Putin is playing a long game, thinking that he can simply outlast Zelensky, that there'll be some sort of political fracture. And so right now, we don't see, I think, a clear end game that leaves Ukraine in a good spot. And for reasons that elude me, Trump doesn't understand that Putin is playing him, and that if he's going to get a peace deal on terms acceptable to Ukraine and to European allies, he's got to put more pressure on the Kremlin.
And Charles, was there any sense of the generational change underway in American politics, particularly in the Democratic Party, with AOC being there? I think she spoke on Friday. She got a lot of friendly press. Was there a contrast there between her and Rubio and Trump's people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you know, AOC is here. I just ran into Gavin Newsom on the street, and so there are fresh faces that are here, and I think in some ways AOC is here, Gavin Newsom is here because they're trying to increase their visibility in foreign policy. They want to learn more about foreign policy, and so yeah, these are new faces on the block. Where, you know, I think that when we get to the next presidential election, we will, no matter who wins, be turning to the next generation of leadership in the United States. Right now, we're kind of in this transition. And in some ways, having people like AOC here, Gavin Newsom, Alyssa Slotkin is another younger up-and-coming senator. There are people here that I think Europeans want to get to know, and they're here in part because they want to increase their chops when it comes to foreign policy.
But is there any residue from Davos? Because my understanding, obviously I wasn't there, but the coverage that I looked at indicated that Mark Carney's speech was incredibly well received, whereas Trump's speech the next day was completely incoherent and embarrassing. And a lot of the richest people in the world sitting there in the audience just were scratching their heads thinking, my God, what's happened to the United States?
Listen, is there irreparable damage that has been done, not just because of Greenland and Davos, but because the United States is passing through a period of political dysfunction and unpredictability that is on show for the rest? Well, no, there's no question about it. And, you know, if you are Germany or you are Poland or Japan or South Korea, you have to ask, how long can I count on Uncle Sam, right? Regardless of who wins the next election, regardless of whether the Democrats take the House in the next midterms, there's no question that countries are hoping for the best, hoping that the United States remains a strategic partner and a security guarantor, but everybody knows that they have to have a plan B. They're hoping for the best, but we now live with a level of uncertainty coming out of Washington that is on show and inescapable.
Well, Charles Kupchan, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Good to be with you, Ian.
Thank you. And again, I've been speaking with Charles Kupchan, who was Director for European Affairs on the National Security Council during the Clinton administration. He's now a Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and spent the last 3 years of the Obama administration as Special Assistant to President Obama for National Security. And he's the author of Power and Transition, The Peaceful Change of International Order, and How Enemies Become Friends, The Sources of Stable Peace. And his latest book is Isolationism, A History of America's Efforts to Shield Itself from the World. And he joined us from the Munich Security Conference. We're going to take a brief station break and get back examining Trump's payoff to the fossil fuel industry, in which he has delivered a death sentence to our children and grandchildren and the planet.
The element heats the air, but it's still damp, cold and bare. You must wear another layer in the shadow of an empire. The factory lathe can be heard in the arcade by stall owners who trade. Every grain must be weighed in the shadow of an empire.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Michael Mann, the Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Science at the University of Pennsylvania and Director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability, and the Media. He contributed to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize and was elected to the United States National Academy of Sciences in 2020. And is the author of numerous books, including Dire Predictions, Understanding Climate Change, The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet. And his latest book is Science Under Siege, How to Fight the Five Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World. Welcome to Background Briefing, Michael Mann.
Thanks, Ian. Always good to be with you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And this is a very sad moment for the planet. It's a sad moment for our children and grandchildren in particular, because the underpinning to all efforts in this country to curb global warming and pollution from fossil fuel, the rule in the Environmental Protection Agency that underpins us all was rescinded, and it means now that there's no climate regulations under the Clean Air Act for motor vehicles, power plants, and other pollution sources that are causing global warming. So in one fell swoop, Trump and his EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin have turned back the clock and given a massive, massive gift to the fossil fuel companies. So is this going to stick?
Yeah, no question about that. And in fact, it was telegraphed, as you know, in Project 2025, before the election. They said that if they regained control of the White House, they would gut the EPA and they would try to eliminate the endangerment finding, because it's a threat to the powerful interests, the polluters and the petrostates that to whom the Trump administration and the Republican Party is now beholden, and the rest of us pay the price. It's obviously a setback. It can be reversed, with a new administration. That's little consolation when it means we're talking 3 years at the very least of a 3-year period where there is essentially no means for regulating carbon emissions at the federal level. That's going to set us back in terms of meeting our emissions targets. It's going to set back global efforts a little bit. Of course, the rest of the world is really moving forward. They recognize that the future of the global economy is in clean energy. That's the great economic revolution of this century. And all the United States gets to decide at this point is whether they get on board or whether we get left behind in terms of our competitiveness in the world. And so, it's obviously something that's, it was an action that is very beneficial to the small number of plutocrats and petrostates to which the Republican Party is beholden, but the rest of us obviously pay the price, and that's where we are. We can still, expect to make some progress at the subnational level. More than half the states actually recognize carbon dioxide as a pollutant and have various policy mechanisms for trying to incentivize clean energy. So at the state level, at the local level, we can still make progress. Other countries are making progress. And so we have to do everything we can in the meantime with the hope that in a few years from now, we can reverse this and hit the ground running.
So Lee Zeldin, the EPA administrator, said, in making this announcement, that they're going to get rid of the underpinning for all efforts to curb global warming. He said that today the Trump EPA has finalized the single largest act of deregulation in the history of the United States of America. Now, that may have been one of the few truthful things that we've heard from this government. But he also was at a Toyota dealership where he said that efforts to curb global warming basically are punishing consumers and making the person that's driving a car feel guilty, which is an absurd notion. I mean, I think that any American would be perfectly happy to buy a hybrid or a electric car as long as they were affordable. I mean, what's he talking about?
Yeah, well, Lee Zeldin would make a good used car salesman because essentially he's trying to sell the American people a lemon. And everything, as you allude to, that he has said there is wrong. The truth is the opposite of what he and Trump are claiming. The reality is that this will cost us dearly. Clean energy is actually cheaper now on a levelized cost basis. It's cheaper than fossil fuel energy. And the only reason fossil fuel energy continues to survive is because of all the sorts of subsidies and incentives, direct and indirect, that the Trump administration, that Republicans and conservatives are providing to the fossil fuel industry to keep it alive. So the reality is that at a time when prices are high, energy prices are high right now, affordability is a major issue going into this midterm election, and we have to remind the American people that this is hurting us in terms of affordability. What they've done right now is they're taking the cheapest sources of energy out of the mix so that we pay more. That's renewable energy. They're taking it out of the mix so we pay more for their fossil fuel energy that obviously is feeding the profits of their co-conspirators, conspirators in the fossil fuel industry, but it's hurting us. And that's not even taking into account, Ian, the fact that this is costing us hundreds of millions of years. The extreme weather disasters that you Californians are more than familiar with, but that we see around the country, the heat waves, wildfires, floods, superstorms, those are costing us hundreds of millions of dollars a year. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year. And so, again, they like to claim that it's too expensive to act on climate. The opposite is true. It's too expensive not to act. I'll say one more thing about that, Ian. They threw out this $1 trillion figure, this claim that it would cost, that they would save the American people more than $1 trillion because of the rescinding of the endangerment finding. It seems to be the same sort of Trumpian math behind their promise that they're going to cut prescription drug prices by 1,500%, which would mean that for a prescription that you now pay $10 for, the drug companies would instead pay you $140. It's ridiculous. It would be laughable if it weren't so tragic.
But this indicates to me, not that it's a big surprise, that Trump is a misanthrope. I mean, he's basically giving my grandkids a death sentence. Yeah. And he's doing it in the name of massive lies like clean coal. There's no such thing as clean coal. Nobody wants them. They're not even economical, these coal plants that he's bringing back. And the Chinese are getting rid of them, and the Chinese are moving aggressively into solar. And and this administration keeps talking about the threat from China, China's military and all this stuff, and an economic competitor and the next hegemon and all this stuff. Well, what's Trump doing? He's helping the Chinese and hurting the American people.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And you could call him a misanthrope. You could call him a sociopath. Some might even call him a psychopath at this point, because the actions that he and his administration are taking are literally a threat to the lives of Americans. When you look at the impacts of fossil fuel burning on water and air quality, as well as the climate disasters that are resulting, people are losing their lives because of our continued reliance on fossil fuels. China recognizes that, as you say. That's why they're moving away from fossil fuels. They've paid the price. They're a command and control economy, so the government pays for all the damage that water and air pollution, the health consequences of that, and the climate consequences. And so you're absolutely right, Ian. We have to remind the American people that not only are the actions of this administration hurting us in terms of affordability, they're hurting us in terms of our competitiveness in the world at a critical juncture.
So President Obama has said that repealing the endangerment finding will make Americans less safe, less healthy, and less able to fight climate change, all so that the fossil fuel industry can make even more money. So he asked them, for the big oil companies, for $1 billion each or something. And it looks like they've played a nice little stealth game here. They put out ads, saying how they're really interested in dealing with global warming and et cetera. All that greenwashing goes on at the same time. They've essentially got Trump to do their bidding. So he's taking the heat, in effect, isn't he, for their incredible greed and the windfall that they get.
Oh yeah, no, it's clearly a payoff to them for the help that they provided him, getting him elected. I hope that Governor Newsom is listening right now, because if there's a little bit of a silver lining here, some legal experts have pointed out that by taking away the ability of the federal government to regulate polluters, that actually opens them up now to state-level liability. The damage that they are doing, that becomes a state-level issue, because the federal government is now taking no ownership of the climate crisis. And so states like California could rightfully bring lawsuits against the fossil fuel majors for the damage that they're doing, for the cost that the state is bearing because of their continued extraction of fossil fuels.
Right, but the link between burning fossil fuels and the wildfires that have been devastating here in the city of Los Angeles. My own relatives lost their homes and friends have lost their homes. There's a direct connection, isn't there?
There is.
And we pay
and there's a precedent. There's a precedent, actually. And some European countries are now looking at it's what's known as attribution. You can show that some of these disasters are extremely unlikely to have happened in the absence of human-caused warming. So just like the tobacco industry was successfully sued for the health consequences of their product, even though it was a statistical relationship, the same thing is true here. Yes, it's a statistical relationship. You can't prove that every single wildfire was caused by climate change. But what you can say is that the likelihood and the occurrence of these disastrous events has increased by such a large percent because of carbon pollution and the warming of the planet, that there is real liability there. And so, again, if there's a silver lining here, it may be that individual states can actually now successfully pursue litigation against these fossil fuel companies.
And California is what, the fifth largest economy on the planet?
That's my understanding. Right. I don't know, unless it's moved up to number 4. But
right. So can then Newsom and the state of California still force Detroit to make non-polluting cars?
They can, absolutely, and I know that Governor Newsom. I've spoken with him before. He takes the climate, crisis extremely seriously. He understands what a threat it is to the great state of California, and I would love to see California, Governor Newsom, step up now.
Well, there's a real possibility, though, isn't there, that the abdication of the federal government in dealing with the biggest crisis facing humanity and the planet itself, in order to get payoffs from the oil companies, or to pay them back for helping elect Trump and the Republicans. Is there a possibility here that this could be an electoral issue? I mean,
Absolutely.
what does your polling tell you about how people feel about global warming?
Yeah, we here at the Annenberg School for Communication have an appointment in the Annenberg Public Policy Center, and we do some public opinion work. I'm involved in some of that, but I also keep tabs on sort of the larger efforts when it comes to public opinion assessment. Yale and George Mason University have done regular polling on, if you talk to Ed Maybach and Tony Lasarowitz of the Yale GMU polling effort, they'll tell you that, something like 70% of the American public is at least concerned about climate change and wants to move towards clean energy, supports efforts to move towards clean energy. So the public's on our side. As you say, states can now move forward. Gavin Newsom could move forward as governor of California. Who knows? In a few years, it could be President Gavin Newsom who would have an opportunity to help undo the damage that this administration is doing right now.
So is there then, again, Newsom, who's obviously running for president, could this be his signature issue? I mean, how much traction does it have? Can people make the obvious link between huge storms, hurricanes, and here in the west and southwest, forest fires?
Yeah, the devastating wildfires like the fire from a couple of years ago, where, again, the forces of denial moved in quickly. They flooded the airwaves. They flooded sort of our public sphere with all sorts of conspiracy theories. And that was to distract. That was to make it difficult for people like the governor to talk about the role that climate change played in that unprecedented disaster. Like I said, I've talked to Gavin Newsom before about climate change. I know that he's extremely well educated about the science. He understands the consequence. He's passionate about this issue. And so I do see a real opening. And again, public opinion is on his side. Upwards of 70% of the American public. That means a fair number of Republicans, and especially younger Republicans, care about this problem quite a bit. And especially, if you're a politician like the governor, I think it's going to be essential to be able to connect the dots between what Trump is doing on clean energy and affordability. Not only is it costing us in the climate damage it's creating, but it's actually making energy prices more expensive because he's doing everything he can to take the least expensive energy options out of the mix, clean energy. By dismantling clean energy infrastructure, as the administration is doing right now, they're driving up energy prices. And so there's a direct link to affordability, which obviously is going to be a key issue going into these midterm elections.
Well, Michael, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian. Always a pleasure, as I said.
And again, I've been speaking with Michael Mann, who's a Presidential Distinguished Professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Pennsylvania and Director of the Penn Center for Science, Sustainability and the Media. He contributed to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize and was elected to the United States National Academy of Sciences in 2020 and is the author of numerous books, including Dire Predictions, Understanding Climate Change, The New Climate War, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet, and his latest book is Science Under Siege, How to Fight the 5 Most Powerful Forces That Threaten Our World. And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org. backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.